Hi everyone, we're going to wait 30 seconds just to inform you that the chat function is disabled and you can ask questions in the Q&A tab below. Thank you. Evening everyone, it's Amarvir again, Secretary of the Economy and Finance Network. As a network, we have a track record of bringing tangible change to national policy as well as local and regional policy as well. This is evidenced with our submissions to the National Policy Forum, a role in Lobos and local government, and fusing data analytics alongside geospatial maps to bring data-driven insights to bring about policy change. From Python to Power BI, we have it all. So why join Momentum? But like the modern Labour Party, we do yearn for change in the Fabians. Most of our members are male, are white, and are based in London. But thankfully, my network has informed me that this is the first time that either in the senior or the Young Fabians, we've had 3 BAME female MPs speaking about events that's not explicitly solely about BAME or gender alone. It's only been since 1884. So welcome to the final event of the Young Fabian Conference line of events. We have saved the best till last. We are here this evening to find out from the next generation of Labour policy makers how they will influence the next generation of economic policies. Exactly 100 years since the first ever Labour government was formed, leading to the 2024 general election, led by a fellow Fabian alumni himself, Ramsay MacDonald. But of course, Labour has the stigma of being associated as being a black and white television and a coloured TV era. Stuck in the past, some may say. But luckily, our superstar expert panelists were considered by our network as the best place to confront the issues of Labour simply being a tax and spend party. In the starting lineup, we have Rushanara Ali to kick us off, who was elected in Bethnal Green and Bow in 2010. Ali doubled her majority in the 2015 general election and continually increased her vote share in the subsequent 17 and 19 elections. The words meteoric rise slip off the tongue. In her previous career, Ali was an associate director of the Young Foundation, focusing on social innovation, and she was also a commissioner on the London Child Poverty Commission. Great to have you here. Further west along the central line, we have Dr. Rupa Huq. Dr. Huq won the 2015 election within Ealing Central and Acton after snatching power away from the Conservatives with a massive 13% swing. As a Member of Parliament, she's a member of 2 committees, Committee on the Future Relationship with the EU and the Panel of Chairs. In a previous life, before being a Member of Parliament, Dr. Huq was a lecturer within social sciences, as well as being an author across 4 top-selling publications. We welcome you here, thank you. Turning more central, we have Bilal Mahmood, serves as the Vice Chair of Labour in the city. Bilal is a senior legal counsel for the China Construction Bank, the world's 2nd largest commercial bank. Aside from working finance during the day, Bilal becomes a giant killer by night. In 2015 and 17, Bilal stood as a parliamentary candidate against Ian Duncan Smith, narrowed the electoral gap from 13,000 to 2.4, achieving a record-setting 16% swing, transforming the safe Conservative seat formerly held by Norman Tebbit and Winston Churchill into a key blue-red marginal. It's great to have you, and it's great to continue working with you. Thank you. Now, past the Midlands, through the Humber, across the Weir, swimming up the Tyne, we have Chinyere Susan Onwurah, Shadow Minister for Science, Research and Digital. So I've known Chi whilst campaigning for her at Durham University, and on one occasion whilst door knocking for her in her constituency of Newcastle upon Tyne Central, I came across one individual who looked at me strangely when I offered him a leaflet with Chi's face on. He took it politely, but with clenched teeth, and was forcefully being polite. 1 week afterwards, within the branch meeting, someone said, "That's someone called Timothy Farron, by the way." I didn't know who he was. But the following week after that, when I woke up to Good Morning Britain, I realised that same person I gave the leaflet to was then elected of the Lib Dems. Just goes to show you how unsafe the heartlands actually are. She is often dubbed by locals as the 2nd most beloved individual in Newcastle upon Tyne, after the great footballing legend Alan Shearer, where she serves as the Member of Parliament from 2010. She is staggeringly overqualified compared to her opposite number, the Tory Amanda Holloway MP, where she worked as a chartered electrical engineer for over 20 years and helped to create the internet. With her high-flying marks from Imperial College London, she is repeatedly cited within industry as a leading figure of the advanced guard of the female tech engineers. Meanwhile, Amanda worked in Sainsbury's retail supermarket. Just goes to show the difference. She is often also dubbed within Westminster as being the scientist of Westminster, the Northern powerhouse, and the actual angel of the North. But in all seriousness, it just goes to show you that even opposition, you could contribute to the supply side infrastructure of the UK. She does this, all of this, whilst chairing the All Parliamentary Group of Black Business Ownership. It's great to have you, and we just hope we could build a bond after this event as well. And to top this off, we have Marion Sharples from the Women's Budget Group. So Marion manages the Commission on Gender Equal Economy, and its final report is due next week on Wednesday. Currently, Marion is a core social fellow, key member of the Gender and Trade Working Group of Women in Development Europe, and previously Marion worked in policy at the Gender Development Network and the European Women's Lobby. I wanted Marion, as soon as I got elected in January 2020 as a secretary, to come on events, and now we finally got her. So we welcome you here, thank you. Now, my network is saying stop talking, let the panelists speak. That's what they came here for. So I'm going to kick us off on the first issue of young people. So I think Rushanara and Rupa, perhaps you two are best placed in this. And the first question is, I'll just give you some context. Since 1963, when the British election study was released, young people as a demographic have largely voted for the Labour Party. However, increasingly, the same age group have switched away and voted for other political parties, mainly Green and the SNP, or increasingly do not vote. In terms of unemployment, it's young people that have been hit the hardest, as we've seen with the latest claimant count figures released last week. This is especially the case as young people account for a larger proportion of those who work in the leisure industry. So Rushanara, what does the future hold for young people, and what policies should Labour do to support and help them, especially in what is likely to be tough economic times? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be joining you all, and it's wonderful to be on this panel with my two amazing colleagues, and also with Marion, whose organisation I often refer to when I'm in my Treasury Committee role, and other panellists as well. I think that we need to sort of look back at what's happened, particularly over the last decade for young people. And I would look back at the last financial crisis when we saw unemployment soar among young people, to 1 million. The last Labour government introduced the Future Jobs Fund. The current government has tried to do a variant of that now. I don't think it's good enough, but it's something, and we've got to try and make it work to help young people. But if you look at what's happening to young people's prospects, the younger generation are not going to do better than their parents' generation. We've raised that for many years, that we need to do much more to improve their lot. So how do we do that? This is a generation that's facing COVID, generation COVID, but generation kind of extinction rebellion, if you like, in terms of the climate change threat. And so this generation is not only worse off than their parents' generation, but on their shoulders will rest the big challenges, global challenges as well as local challenges, that we will need them to be resilient and successful to be able to cope with, because previous generations haven't done enough, including our own, I would say, to provide a more hopeful future. And I hope that that's what our party can now do in terms of building policies and ideas for the future. And I suppose what I would do is look at 2 or 3 areas in terms of where we go from here. The first is about rebalancing the asset base. How do we transfer wealth and income to the younger generation, so that they can be homeowners, so that they can get job opportunities, training opportunities, so that they can get access to meaningful work, and so they can do the jobs that are necessary for the future, which she has done huge amounts of work on. The role of tech is something that we need to look at as a party, and I know she has done, and other colleagues have done as well. And then the second part of it is then about how we deal with the social inequalities, which have already been there, and COVID has laid bare those inequalities very starkly between different groups of young people, those from working class backgrounds, those from BAME backgrounds, those with disabilities, and the list goes on. And we've seen that. We've seen inequality literally killing people during this crisis. So if anyone was any doubt about what it means and the economic harm as well as social damage to our society, then the case has been made very clearly and tragically by this pandemic. So we've got to make sure that we as a party put in policies and investments going forward, so that from early years, and we did a lot of that in the last Labour government, but we need a transformation, a revolution in what we put in terms of investment for young people, because that is the generation that's going to have to deal with the challenges ahead. And actually, that's where we can instill optimism and hope, not only for young people, but the older generation, the generations, the parent generation and the grandparents' generation, because the level of anxiety and concern for the younger generation is increasing even more than it already has been, had been there for the last decade because of this pandemic and also the climate emergency.
Excellent. Thank you, Rushanara. Rupa?
Yeah, look, I want to echo everything that Rush said, and she's a good friend of mine. It's good to see Bilal as well. We've got some funny photos from 2015 at all those candidate training things that we went on. So I'm really honoured and flattered, Amarvir, to be here at all, because I'm not an economist at all. I'm a sociologist, so those people that are obsessed about things like class. And the PhD I got was actually in youth culture. So the first, not really best-selling, but thank you for picking it up, book I wrote was kind of that, and it was on sort of what it is to be a youth now, because Rushanara is absolutely right. It's usually assumed that you will do better than your parents who had a tin bath or whatever, or in our case, we had parents who came from the subcontinent, and it was a completely different sort of setup to what their life is now. And so sort of, if you look at so youth at the root of it means state of being young, culture means way of life. So I looked at youth culture and pop music. Again, I'm a bit of a phony doctor. But if you even look at those slogans in the 60s, it was things like be reasonable, demand the impossible, or, you know, all you need is love. They were quite sort of ambitious slogans. Then in the 70s, it was punk and it was anarchy in the UK. So we'd gone from hippie. And then by the 90s, when I was doing all this, yeah, the 80s obviously was, again, hedonism in hard times type of situation. It had turned into rave slogans like sorted, safe, mad for it. And people said that these slogans are getting more and more trite as times are getting harder. I mean, I would say now, I would completely agree with Rushanara that the balance of sort of assets people have has gone completely the wrong way. So, I mean, I represent quite a young constituency, and there's a large proportion of sort of private rent. We've seen just this week that the eviction ban has gone, and it just seems all the odds are stacked against the current generation. I was probably the last person, I was born in 1972, I was able to buy, because in those days on an academic, 2 academic salaries in the 90s, it was possible. But I remember I did a speech in the House of Commons, and on the London housing market, the Standard called it MP Blast's Who Stole My Cheese generation, because it's kind of stunting people's growth. If at the age of 30, 35, they're in a shared household worrying about whether their food from the fridge is going to be nicked. So, I mean, I think we need a massive house building programme for people of all pockets and all tenures, actually. So again, you said, Amarvir, that Labour has been seen as this sort of capitalism is bad, private ownership is bad, but there's a very fundamentally British thing about wanting your own roof over your head, and I think we have to recognise that. And then I suppose all those other general things about making I think that's coming up in some of the other questions, an economy that's less exploitative. So things like, we've always said we're going to get rid of 0 hours contracts, those kind of things. And the Green New Deal that we promised last election, that did tap into a thing, you know, Greta Thunberg has her devotees. Every Friday, I think there's a climate strike. Until COVID and the lockdown outside Parliament, you could see the energy that the Extinction Rebellion people had unleashed. So, I mean, all those kind of things. I don't know what youth culture is anymore. I think that's a sign I'm turning into a boring old fart. Yeah, although I have a teenager.
I think you're actually amongst one of the youngest as well, Rupa.
Oh, come on. Look how much grey hair there is here. Anyway, sorry, I don't want to hog the time. Everyone else has got interesting things to say. That is just some youth culture, youth things from me.
No, excellent. We need more of that, and we are the Young Fabians, so I come to the right place. Speaking of the Green New Deal, now this question about income inequality, something you brought up as well, and the environment. So I'm going to pass the ball to Chi on this one. So being a scientist herself, as a successor of a dynasty of engineers and scientists from the region, how I'm going to contextualize this is that despite the deindustrialization, our network has calculated that the Northeast specialism defined by local quotients is still within electricity, steam, air, manufacturing, mining and quarrying. And on Sunday, a fellow Young Fabians event, she also said that economic growth is not an end in itself, but what matters is how that growth is generated and how the rewards are shared. Mm-hmm. So, Chi, how can we build an economy that is fairer and more sustainable after COVID-19? Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks firstly for that amazing introduction, Amarvir. Made me feel impressed by myself. And thanks also to the comments that Rushanara and Rupa made, and I support that wholeheartedly. And so in this, how can we? I mean, I could obviously talk about this forever, but it is my persistent and passionate view that we can build an economy which is not only more sustainable, well, is sustainable, because we're not sustainable now, is sustainable, but it is also fairer, and it is empowering of young people in particular. And in terms of how we do that, as you said, my background, I'm an engineer, and one of the things that inspired me to be an engineer were the first industrial revolution, which was a carbon-based revolution, and which has generated the, if you like, the carbon-based economy that we had now. And it also generated a huge amount of inequality, as people moved from the land into cities and towns and were basically exploited as units of labor. What I also say is that was an industrial revolution that happened before we had democracy. The people who were working in those factories, in Stevenson's factory in Newcastle, couldn't vote. And now we have an opportunity, with the green industrial revolution, to shape that in a way which is fairer and more equal, as well as being sustainable. And just let me say two or three things about that. So firstly, we have to save the planet. We have to change the way in which our economy works. But it's not right to say that industry, manufacturing, and our planet are kind of like opposed in some way. Many of the technologies, and it's not rocket science, I'm not sure rocket science is sustainable, but it's not rocket science. Many of the technologies exist already in terms of energy, as you mentioned, we can sustainable energy combined with new and, for me, hugely inspiring forms of batteries, so that we can store the energy. We haven't, there is energy on the planet, from the sun, etc. We've got to be able to capture it and store it, and the technology is there, but we need significant investment in commercializing it and bringing it to us, and that involves investment in skills and in people. And I suppose to reflect partially what Rushanara was saying about our assets, our assets are the assets of our economy are and always have been the people. But the way in which some of the incentives for our economy are shaped is that there's incentives to invest in technology. I'm all for that, but not to invest in people. And what we need to do, and particularly now when we are facing a recession, sort of the like of which we haven't known for decades, if at all, is to take that time to give the skills and the training and the, if you like, the infrastructure of sustainable growth, so that whether that be testing facilities for small companies, whether that be supporting universities so that young people coming out of universities can start their own companies, whether that be more apprenticeships. Ed Miliband's talked of an army of 100,000 climate change apprentices, is to invest in that in this time, and also to make it a mission. And don't let me get me started on Boris Johnson's moonshots, but to make this a mission for our nation, because and I'll finish there because I could talk about this forever now, and I'm not going to. But one of the things that was always struck me as generally the only woman engineer in the room, whenever I was working as an engineer, is that people talk that our technology, our engineering is so male dominated, and people talk about women being more attracted by the caring professions. And the traditional caring professions should be much better paid, and I think that's an economic change in itself to recognize that. But also, there is nothing more caring than saving the planet. There's nothing more caring than ensuring that that we can live sustainly. And when I've spoken at the Friday climate strikes, which I've done in Newcastle every month before the lockdown, I was so struck by the young people, girls and boys, and their commitment to make that kind of change, being inspired by a sustainable future, that kind of energy and inspiration could be, by the right government, the right policies, could take that energy and inspiration and give us a net zero economy, which was fairer and had that took everyone's talents, was not so was diverse, and shared the wealth more fairly as well.
Excellent. Thank you for opening our eyes onto that. On the issue of income inequality, looking at all the local authorities in the UK, Rushanara's constituency touches one of the most unequal in terms of income deciles. Rushanara, how do you think the Labour Party is best placed to address this?
Well, thank you very much. So I think in terms of our analysis, it's really important that we recognize inequality wherever it exists. And I think sometimes the narrative has tended to go down the track of, North equals poor, South equals rich, London equals sort of London elite, and metropolitan London is often used as a euphemism to talk about, to delegitimize actually concerns about poverty and inequality in London. And it's as if we don't have any problems. Now, I'm one of the biggest kind of advocates of rebalancing our economy and redistributing wealth to different regions and different parts of the nation. That said, I think we as a party need to look very carefully at where things are going badly wrong, wherever that happens to be in our country. So in constituencies like mine, child poverty is the highest in the country, despite all the wealth, despite the large amounts of investment and regeneration and money that came into the borough during the last Labour government. So we made transformations in education, but child poverty has continued to be stubbornly high. We made some progress, but gone into reverse over the last decade. And across London, child poverty is twice as high, and it's remained so compared to the rest of the country. So I think that we need to look at what links different parts of the country in terms of social challenges. So my constituency will have a great deal in common in terms of other constituencies outside of London with insecure work as well as child poverty. And then other issues like overcrowding and housing, and the cost of housing obviously is quite a unique problem in cities like London, where you've got high demand for properties and high levels of cost of housing, which then pushes people into poverty. So in terms of as a party, we need to get the granularity of our analysis right. So I recognise the push for, you know, in terms of the Brexit agenda and the red wall seats and all of that debate. But I think it's important to combine those challenges, and then I would go back to the issues around where the investment needs to go. It needs to go into childcare. It needs to go into early years education. It needs to go into youth services and youth provision. We've seen cuts over the last decade that's bewildering in constituencies like mine, but also in other constituencies around the country. And then if you look at the social inequalities that young people face growing up, we've seen knife crime and other things going up across the country, and in London that's been a big problem. So we've got to look at the experience of young people from childhood all the way up to their mid-20s. I'd say, you know, I would broaden the definition of youth up to 30, probably, given that, as Rupa said
Young
earlier,
Fabians is actually 31, so that's quite generous.
Exactly. So I think that Labour policy ought to encompass youth up to 30, at least 30, 31, because of the points people made, others have already made about the fact that, you know, it's very difficult to get onto the housing ladder until you're well into your 30s, and sometimes not even then. So we've got to do that, and then investment has to be linked to the skills agenda, which she's already referred to. There's so much that we can do, and in terms of the point about money and financing it, I mean, if you look at what the government is doing at the moment, I think that this government during this crisis, of course, there are some things we've supported as a party, but there are things they're doing that is costing billions, that frankly is wasteful. So this job retention bonus, which is £9 billion, is a dead weight loss. That £9 billion could be used to keep people in work and keep people provide targeted support to those families and those children that desperately need support, that are going hungry right now.
Excellent. Thank you, Rushanara. So that neatly brings us to the next question of fiscal responsibility. It's a dreaded question. I don't think anyone wants to answer, but I'm going to give this one to Bilal. It seems the most hungry right now. So Labour, so a question that's often asked is, if you give a person some money who's a Labour supporter some money to buy some bread, will they actually give you the change back, or will they just spend it all on sweets? So Labour has often been associated as a party of tax and spend. The Chancellor in his maiden speech had said that no more irresponsible borrowing, no more spiralling debt, no more passing the debt to the next generation. And less than 5 years later, as Rushanara mentioned, that he broke all his promises. Debt has exceeded by £2 trillion for the first time. In the process, even the BBC, an independent media outlet, has dubbed him super rishi, especially with policies such as Rushanara mentioned, the coronavirus job retention scheme, VAT cut from 20 to 5%, the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which also pulled CPI inflation down. With his face across every single Wetherspoons in the UK, the common person on the street would find it hard to resist calling him the Chancellor, Super Sunak, leaving our shadow Chancellor in the starting blocks. And yet, Bilal, the Labour has often been associated as a party which is fiscally irresponsible. What do you think the current party and our panelists must do in order to change this perception? And by the way, everyone is free to muck in with this one. It's quite a difficult one, so I think it'll be quite, rude to just let Bilal handle this one by himself, but thank you.
Thank you for both the introduction. I really am punching above my weight in this panel, and to be here. And I think you touched upon it in your intro as well. You know, after 10 years of Tory austerity, after an inflating housing market, after a wider gap of inequality now than we had since Thatcher was in power, it's somewhat galling to still be seen as the party of tax and spend. And particularly with the young people now, and recent studies say that if you're unemployed between your 20s and 30s, you're going to be around 15 to 25% worse off to your counterparts in 20 years' time. So anybody who's losing jobs now in the COVID generation isn't going to just feel it now, it's going to feel it in the next few generations to come. So fiscally, what can we do? Well, you know, as Rupa mentioned, we were candidates in 15 and 17, and we always felt
Sorry, Bilal, sorry, can you repeat the last 5 seconds of what you said? Sorry. I think we need to invest in Labour's policy to roll out broadband from the 2019 election, it seems.
I think what we need to treat the COVID pandemic and this existential crisis as a challenge for us to look transformatively at how we look at the economy. The British economy is largely based on financial markets and short-term capitalism, which is based on short-term gains and profits. Not to get too Keynesian about this, but this is an opportunity for us to make a case for a transformative way of looking at how the economy funds and betters everybody in society. And we can do that in a number of ways. The first is to look at looking at financial markets and realizing and appreciating that classical form of liberalism and capitalism isn't the invisible hand and trickle down that will fix everything. I sometimes think of it more of a zoo where lots of things are available, but if unherded and untamed, it's not going to work. So what we need is a robust intervention by the government to look for what is the public benefit in capitalism. How do we make companies and corporates not just look at their bottom line, but what added value and what public benefit we can give back to society? Now, we've talked a lot about climate change, but when I think about the Green New Deal and listening to more about AOC was talking about, it's both the climate, but it's also about sustainability. And part of that is what lots of companies are now starting to talk about, which is ESG, or environmental, social, and governance, which is not just how much do we make money, but how do we put back into society? And I think for us, for Labour looking forward to say, look, the past 10 years have not done you any well. The past 10 years fiscally have shown that their way is not the right way. But we need to look at what we can do now, both for the future and how to rebuild and how to almost reprogram markets, companies, and employment in general, about not just about how to make money, which is great, and also feed back into the public good, but also about what we're doing as a public good. There's been some very good ideas that are available. People have talked about, I think, in fact, the Fabian pamphlet most recently talked about the Companies Act being rewritten to make sure that particularly retail banks, have separate arms that deal with just investing for public benefit. We've looked at social impact bonds around the world, which is a way of financing and funding projects within the country that help and build up the economy as well. And just talking fiscally specifically, we're worrying about quantitative easing. Well, we're always worried about printing new money, but at a time where actually it's not so much the assets that matter, it's the cash flow that is fundamentally important to everybody, from large corporate banks to people, our neighbors. And so things like quantitative easing, thinking about really expanding the British Business Bank and British Investment Bank, things like ensuring that there is a lender of last resort from the Bank of England to lenders to make sure that that money goes to small businesses and people who need it on fair terms. Those are the kind of policies that we can be talking about that shows almost a paradigm shift, moving away from, greed is good for what you want, but actually there's a more useful thing. And another thing, working in the finance sector and being in Labour in the city, I always feel like I'm on the back foot having to explain why I can be both working in finance and also be a member of the Labour Party, and that why am I not always hating bankers? The banking and financial system is never going to go away anytime soon in the way that we see it. So we're either faced with the fact of we can transform it to work for the benefit of society in the way that we want to, or we can lose oxygen in haranguing it and making ourselves feel good. Now, I think the former is probably the better way of doing it, to restructure all of it. So it's taken a lot of time there, but in short, it's about fiscally reimagining what society could be if we took perhaps more of a, dare I say it, Keynesian way of treating the economy, and also highlighting how the classical capitalist invisible hand hasn't been working for anybody for the past 10 years.
No, excellent. The Tories are, so according to our macroeconomist Chris, the Tories are seen now as embarking on Keynesian economic principles during these times. So how can Labour differentiate ourselves from the Conservative Party now? Does anyone want to answer that? Or are we just too close to the Conservatives with Keir? Are we just too central? Is there any point of voting Labour?
It's true that this crisis has sort of shifted things as well. because policies like a huge economic stimulus, nationalising railways, hell, even free broadband don't look as outlandish as they did in December. And even before the job retention scheme and some of the bigger things, there was the Rishi Sunak budget. I think it was the beginning of March. And people say that the photos of the backslapping between Johnson and him and all the front bench just would not have happened now. I know a lot of our colleagues, sorry, we're being recorded, maybe I shouldn't be too honest. I mean, people were a bit downbeat that they've nicked all our policies. They're doing this on purpose. And in a way, I think Boris Johnson he only believes in himself. He doesn't really have any ideology or principles or anything like that. They're kind of expendable. So I would, agree with everything Bilal said. But and we also see that this crisis, there are companies that are taking advantage of COVID to make changes that they would have liked to always make. British Airways springs to mind. But I think there are other companies that are restructuring, that have taken job retention money, the clue is in the name, and then they're sort of sacking loads of people with these crazy fire and rehire sort of contracts. So, I mean, I'd agree with what Rushanara said at the beginning as well. I used to, when I took people into the House of Commons, show them in Portcullis House those pot plants and say they're on a PFI contract. You know, our children's children will be paying that off. But now it's everyone's Nando's that they had all those weeks. And I feel that was eat out to help Rishi. As you say, it's his signature policy, not just his autograph as well. He's got his own brand. I think he's on manoeuvres, and I just don't know. They're so shape-shifting, this lot. I can't.
This is the problem with Labour, though. I mean, I myself, I love a good Wetherspoons coming from Stoke-on-Trent North, and just see Rishi's face everywhere. And then our chair, Marion, hosted an event with Annalisa Dodds, and I was thinking, poor Dodds, poor Labour, like, we're getting absolutely slaughtered.
Apparently he polls as the person that people, the son-in-law that most women would like to have, older women, I suppose, not the demographic of young Fabians. But I mean, never before has any policy been so associated with one person. Do you know what I mean? I think if you did Pointless, that programme, normally most people haven't heard of cabinet ministers, but he's definitely carving a niche, isn't he?
I mean, so I think I think given this government and for Rishi Sunak has succeeded in identifying himself with Eat Out to Help Out. I think Labour can distinguish ourselves from the Tories by some basic competence, but that's not at the moment right now. But actually, that's not the distinction that I really want to see us make. I mean, I do want to see us make that distinction, but I think in addition to that, we've also got to distinguish ourselves by a vision for what our future society looks like, because and that's what I actually really liked about Keir Starmer's speech when he said, we don't know what the policies will be in the manifesto, which I think we've got to be working on, but it will sound like the future arriving. Whereas with Boris Johnson and Cummings, etc., what we have is like this sort of ad hoc, Rishi may be the favourite son-in-law, Boris is the person that people would like to have a drink with, but where is that leading to? Where is it going? And what you see is ad hoc sort of individualism, and it's when Johnson was saying yesterday about we're a freedom-loving nation, and that's why we're all going to be dying from COVID. I mean, it's what we've got to do is have a vision, and then have the sort of the coherent policies and which reflect that. And I thought what Bilal was saying around around companies and the environment. I mean, companies have always had their corporate social responsibility or whatever. But where Labour has had a challenge is in identifying what we like about companies. We're very keen, very able, to criticise companies. And as someone who worked in the private sector for 20 years, I know there's a lot to criticise, but we've been very difficult to say what good companies should look like. And I think where we can also, where we can say, whereas the Conservatives are giving sort of bungs to their friends, etc. What we are doing is holding business to account and promoting. Most people work for businesses, promoting, supporting, identifying those businesses which are contributing to a sustainable future and to a more fairer and more equal society. And I think that's why it's really important to be able to measure environmental contribution, measure supply chains and modern day slavery in supply chains, and then come down really hard on those who aren't doing that. in doing that. And I think that will show vision, consistency, coherence, and understanding of the detail in a way which this government just cannot.
Can I just add a couple of points, a few points to that? And I think, I mean, the areas where I'd like to see our party develop policy and ideas more on in the coming months and years is around what ethical capitalism looks like, or you could call it responsible capitalism, but what does responsible growth and inclusive growth look like? And I know Fabians have done a lot of work on this. Women's Budget have done a lot of work. I'd really like to hear from Marion. And what in terms of areas that we should really develop over the coming months and years in terms of policy ideas is around what does a green economy look like? Because in the last Labour government we started this work, but then we were pushed out of power. And in a way the Conservatives stopped quite a lot of those things. They're returning to it, but having lost a decade. So the green economy could have flourished by now if they didn't remove all the green subsidies and the infrastructure investment around carbon storage and carbon capture and different kinds of energy and distributed energy sources and so on. So I think there's a big agenda for us to develop where Fabians and others can come in, and the wider Labour movement can come in terms of ideas around green jobs and green. The other thing is around infrastructure and job-rich infrastructure. The Conservatives are talking about it, but we talked about it and we asked them, we kept asking them to do this in the last financial crisis as we were coming out of that crisis. Instead, we got austerity, and they seem to have sort of learned the lesson. Let's hope they do, because we really need that infrastructure investment now in order to grow our way out of this COVID and crisis and the economic crisis that's coming. And the final thing I would say is around how we treat public money. And the procurement scandal and what the government is doing and carving up money and contracts and giving it to their friends and their donors and things like that is an absolute scandal. And as stewards of public money, any government needs to make sure that is spent properly and every penny is spent properly and efficiently. And the word efficiency has been treated like a dirty word sometimes in certain circles, but actually efficient use of public money is a Labour project. It is what our constituents work their socks off doing multiple jobs to put food on the table. So we have a duty to make sure every penny that's spent is spent well and properly, and to tackle the inequalities that exist in our society. So I think making sure that people within our own movement don't see that as something that is associated with other parties, when in fact they're being completely irresponsible in terms of the way they're using public money and wasting hundreds of millions of pounds through contracts that have been given out to people who've not produced anything and so on, is critical, and that has to be done properly.
Excellent. It's a good question, because we also got the lead economist from the CBI watching, as well as the chief economist from the National State Bank of Pakistan. So great, fantastic. Turning now to inequality and within the for gender and also ethnicity as well. So in the light of racial injustice highlighted by the Black Lives Matter movement and the gender pay gap, is Labour equipped to deal with these two systemic issues within our economy? Marion, do you think you could kick us off with that one? Thanks.
Sure, thank you so much, Amarvir. It's great to be here. I've really enjoyed the discussion so far, so thank you very much for having me. I think this year has been a very powerful year for shedding a light on a lot of systemic issues, all of which were already there before this year, but I feel that they have kind of been recognised more broadly as systemic structural issues, and the need for systemic responses has become very clear this year. And I think I don't think we can necessarily see those two issues in isolation, looking at racial inequality and gender inequality. And I think we have to understand that people's lives often don't fit into these neat categories. You know, we're all humans and we all have, you know, a range of different experiences, and you know, our the way we experience the world is nuanced and different, and can't be always carved up into these neat categories, which, you know, can be quite artificial sometimes. I think on the question is one of the parts of the question was about the gender pay gap, and I would actually challenge that to look more broadly at the gender earnings gap. The statistic that we have for the gender pay gap is 9% for full-time employees. For all employees, it's 17%. But actually, if we look at the employment rate, we can combine the employment rate with median annual earnings, and we see that the gender earnings gap between women and men is 43%. That was what it was in 2019, which I think is an absolutely astounding figure, and one that just isn't talked about enough. And one of the reasons for that is, you know, we have to look beyond reasons for the gender pay gap itself. We have to look more broadly at gender inequality within the economy, and one of the key causes of that is inequality in unpaid care. And as you mentioned, Amarvir, I have been running the Commission on a Gender Equal Economy for the last 18 months or so. We're launching our final report next week, which I'll be very happy to circulate. But earlier in the year, we did a report showing the kind of cyclical nature of gender inequality, and how a lot of it stems from imbalances within unpaid care, and how that leads to women earning less over the course of their lifetimes, owning less, being more likely to live in poverty, using more social security and public services, and how this cycle is really reinforced, and the different stages, you know, you have social norms and stereotypes, and that really reinforces all of these different pieces of the puzzle. So I think that really brings back the point that these solutions, these problems are structural and systemic. They intersect with other forms of inequality very starkly, and that has been specifically that's really been brought to light this year in particular. And I think that the only way to respond to those is to develop structural responses, looking at different areas of the economy. In our report next week, we're looking at international trade policy, the international financial system. We're looking at procurement practices within local government. These changes have to happen across the systems that we've constructed. And I think that goes back to an earlier question about how to, you know, kind of fiscal responsibility and things like that, picking up on what Bilal was saying. And I think there's a whole movement kind of burgeoning already across the world around this idea of the well-being economy, and realigning our economic priorities actually according to people's well-being, the quality of life, the things that actually matter to them. And it's been really interesting to see kind of widespread public support for these kinds of things, particularly over the course of the pandemic. And we can actually look to Scotland and Wales within our own UK, both of whose governments have signed up to this group of wellbeing economy governments, along with New Zealand and Iceland. And there's some really interesting stuff going on there about how to realign economic objectives and priorities according to things which actually matter to people, instead of these kinds of abstract notions of GDP. And I think that's become extra clear this year.
I think that's excellent. Now, Chi, in particular, coming from the Northeast, I actually had my first amateur boxing fight in the same gym that Muhammad Ali went to by Newcastle Airport. I also believe that Dr. Martin Luther King also visited the Northeast, and also that there was an academic that also visited the Northeast in the 19th century. So I understand that Chi, within her position, even within opposition, has addressed this issue in the digital consultation paper. Do you want to tell us about this, specifically about the diversity charter of challenges?
Well,
this is really great.
Yeah, so just to say, yes, Martin Luther King came in 1967, and in, I think it's 1843, it was Frederick Douglass, a leading abolitionist, who came and gave lectures in Newcastle for about 6 weeks, and you know, growing up in Newcastle, you know, with an interest, you might say, in great Black ethnic minority figures of history. I did not know any of that, and the reason I did not know any of that was because it was entirely excluded from from the school curriculum as well as from the media. So I do think that we need to address diversity, and Marion is absolutely right. Sort of everywhere within our party, as well as within our policies. And if the Labour Party can't do it, then the country's in a bad place because no one else is going to, but also our movement is in a really bad place. And so and I will put the link to our digital consultation, which is about our digital future. That's what it's called, and I really would like submissions about how we can make that a fairer and more equal future. The only thing, I'm quite passionate about this, but technology is not something that happens to us. It's something that we can decide the consequences of, but it will exacerbate unfairness and inequality unless it is diverse by design, because the people who are designing it right now are not going to do that. So we really have to, and some of the ways that we can do that are through diversity charters. There's also through a list of I would like a list of algorithms which are being used by the public sector, and to have their biases in the private and the public sector made clear. As you know, you saw the debate over the weekend about, not debate, but Twitter's algorithm for thumbnails from what you post preferences white faces over black faces. Gosh. So and they're investigating, which is fantastic, but think about all the other things that they have algorithms for, where we can't see it visibly what their biases are. So yes, please respond to this, and please let's make technology something that is Labour, the white heat of technology. Let's not using that phrase, but let's make technology something that is Labour. That Labour is going to decide how that makes our future fairer, and not simply as a engine of unequal growth, which is what the government's digital strategy, which is coming out in a month or so, is going to do.
Great, fantastic. Thanks, Chief. Bilal, then I have a quick question for Rupa as well on this one.
Completely jump on this, particularly from what Marion was saying. We talk a lot about the gender pay gap. What we haven't talked as much about, and what's starting to happen, especially in the commercial sector, is talking about the ethnicity pay gap. Currently, that's something along the lines of, if you took the average British Asian or Pakistani Bangladeshi man compared to his counterpart, they're earning something around anywhere up to about 63% less than they would do. So that's a stark number that's not really talked about because it's very hard to tackle. In terms of the question, and I just wanted to touch on this point because I'm quite passionate about that point, is this is the chance for Labour to be quite bold about how to deal with these intersectional points. Now, there's some ideas out there. Now, I'm not advocating them, but I do think this is the time and space to be discussing things like universal basic income and like affirmative action or something similar, to be on the boards of FTSE 250 companies, or to be involved on large corporates. And it's, I think, the time and space for us to be showing the public that we're capable of having these ideas. We may or may not find the right place for them, but I think it's the right time and place to have some very honest and potentially aggressive conversations, because like Marion said, there's a real systemic change that needs to happen. Unless we can show the wider public that we're willing to think like that, to think outside the box, we may run the risk, I think, of falling into the same as all the other parties. That's my 2 cents worth, and I know other people are here to listen to other speakers, but I just wanted to chip on that point particularly.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Chi. Thanks, Bilal, Marion. And Rupa, now coming from West London, and I'm aware that Linford Christie had been stopped by the police before he went on to the Olympics around your area. And you yourself as well, within Parliament, have been repeatedly stopped by members of staff. And also one of your neighbouring MPs. Now, if that happened to me, I would give that person an earache. How do you think is the best way to stop that? Now, I think, as chair of this panel event, I think that's signifies a significant problem within our economy, that people of colour and who are female, especially like my mum, often seen as someone who's perhaps more, less valuable in the labour market. So just in a quick few sentences, how do you think the Labour Party can best address this issue?
I guess it's that thing of, I remember saying at my selection meeting of what was then a Tory seat, I might not look like what an MP looks like, but part of the idea is to change what an MP is. So we need more people, visibly women, you know, every type of inequality as well, ethnicity, sexuality, disability, all of those things in more prominent places, and then not to just pull up the ladder behind them when they get there. And it's good to see Marion as well, because I always cite your stuff. I had a debate on the disproportionate impact of Brexit on women, and I just nicked all your stuff, so sorry about that. But yeah, I mean, I do think COVID's part of a trio of things, because people said this about austerity, didn't they? And they said it again about Brexit, that women, because of the precarious public sector type of roles we do, blah, 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 even as the people that do the shopping with consumer protections going, are going to be hit hardest. But yeah, no, I think sort of more visible people, and also things like equality impact assessments just seem to be so ignored everywhere, that although there is, you know, they're written into the 2010 Act, I think that needs to be a lot more upfront. And, you know, there need to be sort of punitive measures for people who don't comply with these. The monitoring, again, it just seems an afterthought. It's not really, it's a bit half-hearted.
Exactly. The problem is that sometimes when you have, say, someone like yourself, well, yourselves, all of you speaking about this issue, you're often criticised by people on the right, saying like, these people are just whining. Why can't they just get on well with it? And this is seen in football as well. John Barnes can't get to the managerial position as well, being a black footballer, one of the best, I would say. It's a huge issue. Now, we've only got a few more minutes left, so I'm going to just wrap this up and just say thanks. But one final question I just want to ask all the panelists. So in terms of economic policies, what must Labour do to ensure that we are considered a safe pair of hands? And what role should the Young Fabians play on the road to 2024? So I'll just go in alphabetical order. So in terms of surname, so Rushanara. Actually, just put it on.
I'm just going to unmute myself. Well, I think it's really important that we, as a party, demonstrate responsible stewardship of public money, and also ensure that that money is spent properly and effectively and efficiently. It's not sexy to say this, but that's what taxpayers expect of us, even more so of left-leaning governments. And the second, I suppose the second thing is around making sure that the distribution of public money is used in a way to tackle regional inequalities, social and racial and other forms of inequality. So if I was picking two areas where overarching themes that we need to concentrate on is those things, then it's going to be a very difficult climate, because we'll be a highly indebted country in terms of £2 trillion worth of debt and so on. So we're going to have to be very imaginative about how we use technology, how we create a new kind of economy, new kinds of jobs and so on. And just picking up on the final point about diversity and race, I think as a party, we've got a proud record in terms of legislation and enforcement. We need to look at how we rebuild some of the things that have been dismantled over the last 10 years by the last that was established by the last Labour government, that this government's dismantled, from legislation on the duty to promote equality, which has been cast to one side, the regulators actually doing the enforcement, looking at how you can enforce action on companies that are flouting equality legislation. And the same applies around environmental issues. How do we do enforcement in a way that nudges organizations in the right direction, but actually there's a stick to go with it as well? Because and the final thing I'd say is around inclusivity, which is a broader theme around being a party that is genuinely and truly inclusive. We've got a lot of work to do as a party, and that straddles different leaderships. It's not a commentary on who's in charge when, right? And all of us in different ways. This is a very diverse panel, and I think the audience is pretty diverse too. We'll have our own experiences of things that we can see that needs to improve. So it's very important we get our own house in order as a party around the equalities agenda, and then look at how we change society for the better. And I think, you know, we all have to constantly work at this as a party, as a movement, as individuals in in our own daily lives and work, because we are seen, we have to live our values. And sometimes, certainly in recent years, but you can take, if you take a long view, you can see examples of that at different points in our history. That can be we can be seen wanting ourselves, and it's very important to be incredibly self-critical and not be defensive, because that's the way in which we're going to come up with responses and policies, both for our part, in terms of our party as well as our country.
Excellent. Okay, just got to say that Adam, the chair, is just whipping me with a cosh right now. He's saying, tie this up. So one sentence. So I'm going to say Rupa, then Bilal, then Chi, then Marion to tie us up. So one sentence.
Yeah, no, Bill Clinton said it's the economy, stupid. That's completely right. We need to not just look at the blunt instrument of income tax as well. Maybe sort of punishing environmentally irresponsible behaviour, those kind of things we could do as well. And sorry, it's meant to be one sentence. Apparently 1948 was the best year to be born, to be able to have your own house and a job for life with a final salary pension and free love as well before AIDS.
Excellent. Bilal?
I think we have to challenge ourselves to how do we rewire an economy so that it's not just the bottom line, it's about how do we embrace all sectors, including finance and the things that we don't like, to add to the public benefit to build us up for a well-being economy rather than just the bottom line number.
Fantastic. And Chi?
Yeah, being poor and oppressed is really hard work. We have to, it's a full-time job. And we have to show that we recognize what the realities of that poverty and oppression are today in the intersectional way in which the new working classes experience it.
Excellent. Thank you. And Marion?
I would say we need to recenter the economy around care. Not only care services themselves, but as Chi was saying, care for the environment and care for each of us as workers and carers and all the multiple roles that we all have as humans.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to tie this up. So the Economy and Finance Network has often been dubbed as a network on the centre left. I would say that unlike Young Labour students' Momentum, we are not on the centre left, we're just simply pragmatic, expedient and practical. After all, our alumni includes the current Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey. Whether you're from Stoke, Sunderland or Grimsby, if you're a viewer wanting to get involved in the macro social impacts we do, pro bono, hopefully for these MPs as well, projects we've got include the Levelling Up Agenda of the North, homelessness, amongst many others. Apart from that, I just want to say thank you for our superstar panellists. We hope to support them on the road to 2024. And I hope to see you there as well. Thank you very much. Thanks, guys.